Berkeley. So I grew up in Indiana, in a town called Carmel, central Indiana, and I always grew up really loving design and actually was really involved in theater growing up as well as art. So I had a really strong fine arts background. And I felt like my early education and high school education, as well as my travel experiences, really kind of formed me and shaped the desire to seek something pretty encompassing of that in school. So for undergrad, I went to Ball State University, and I actually was crazy enough to do two majors. So I did an undergraduate in architecture, and then I also did a graphic design degree. So I graduated in 2011 with 2 degrees from Ball State. And I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go with that, whether it was more in the design realm or whether it was architecture. And it was still kind of in the recession, that hit the architectural profession a little bit delayed from 2008. So it was a little bit harder to find jobs, but I was one of the lucky ones in my class to get a job working at a small firm in downtown Indianapolis. We were mainly focused in healthcare. So that market was still pretty much driving our, the architectural practice at the time. And I took the job and fell in love with healthcare. So it kind of wasn't something I was planning on loving, but I knew that I wanted to further my experience in it and seeing the way that building design impacts human health as well as environmental health. And the well-being of communities was something that was really powerful. And so I moved to Washington, D.C. I took a job at Smith Group in their healthcare design studio shortly after. And I worked there for about 2 years and found you when I decided to apply to various different schools to study healthcare and to get my master's in architecture.
Great. So tell me a little bit about the process of applying to architecture schools. When we met, take us through your experience at least from what you remember.
Okay, well, I think I was crazy. I decided to apply to like 9 schools. If I could do that over again, I would probably narrow it down a little bit more. But, I came from such a varied interest and a lot of background with not only art and architecture, but healthcare. I also have a secret life in archaeology where I work as a surveyor on different archaeological sites across the world. So I thought maybe historic preservation was a route I wanted to look at too.
After work, you dress up as an archaeologist.
In the summers, I work as an archaeologist. And so I think, I cast a wide net in school in terms of applying. And like I said, I think I applied to 8 or 9 programs, of which, your process really helped me to kind of frame my portfolio, my brand, kind of hone in on each of those specialties and kind of put my best foot forward with each of those modalities and kind of help me frame each application. Although we did end up reusing, I think, the same portfolio or a very similar version of the portfolio in each of them. That was really helpful. So, I think I spent like 6 months preparing all those application materials and then was lucky enough to get into most of the schools I had applied to. And of those, I got into the dual programs of, I think it was Berkeley, Columbia, RISD, and Clemson. And those were kind of my final 4. And I narrowed it down from there. It was a really tough choice. I think, my top, after going to all the open houses, I went to Berkeley, like you mentioned. I went to Columbia. I went to RISD. I didn't go to the RISD open house, but I was interested, of course, in their program, but then I also went to Clemson. And I remember sitting in Columbia's open house and saying, someone was saying, oh, they don't offer financial aid for the first year and it's a 3-year program. And I had already come from a background in architecture. And I remember raising my hand and saying, well, it would cost me at the graduate student rate, increasing from 3 to 6% that year too. For loans, it would have cost me, I think, $1,750 a month for 35 years. And I raised my hand. I was like, well, how do you make that back? I worked in the industry, of course, and felt like I already had a pretty good salary for my position and knew what the cap was. And that was just unthinkable. And I remember them telling me that you can't put a price on a dream. And I was like, yes, you can.
Yep.
So unfortunately, Columbia was out, and Berkeley was a really great offer too. But I did choose to go to Clemson.
Remember the specific offer that they gave you?
I think they gave me they gave me some scholarship that was for both the M.Arch 2 and the Master of Urban Planning dual degree. So I know they admit a certain number of students for both of them, and I was lucky enough to get into both. And I think it was $16,000 a year, which was great. You know, it was pretty significant. And I think on top of that, offering a graduate assistantship, and then after a year having in-state tuition. But it was still a 3-year program, and I was, you know, my parents were very generous to help with my undergraduate education. But I was pretty much putting this one on my own, so that was still a little tough, especially because Clemson had offered a full scholarship. So that was one of the big factors, and also Clemson. They have the best healthcare architecture program in the country. It's actually harder to get into that program than it is to get into Harvard. I didn't believe that until I sat on the other side of the admissions for a little bit while I was there and realized that. So and they accept 8 students a year into that program, and I was lucky enough to get a seat. And you know, the faculty and the passion, and I wanted to pursue healthcare, so there was no better place in the country for me, and it was a really good, ended up being the best decision. Even though it was a little tough to say no to Berkeley, I'm not gonna lie. I remember that was a struggle, but it was a good choice.
What was the name of the fellowship that you got at Clemson? There was a specific name.
Oh, let's see. So Clemson offered me they call it like I think it was a presidential scholarship, or it was the academic. I got both an AIA scholarship to Clemson, and then also their graduate assistantship award, which allowed me to have in-state or really reduced tuition. And then on top of that, that was the scholarship. And then on top of that, I got the graduate assistant award, which allowed me to work when I was there for, I think, 20 hours a week and it was a guaranteed position as long as my, GPA stayed up, which it did. So it was a good, and then they also delayed my admission a semester in order for, one of the big draws for Clemson was their study abroad programs. They have a really great fluid campus program for both their general Master of Architecture students as well as their their undergraduate student. They have offsite locations in Barcelona and Genoa, Italy. But in the healthcare, because the curriculum is so rigorous and it's such a concentrated and special thing, there wasn't the opportunity to travel abroad, and that's something that I really wanted. So I negotiated delaying my admission a semester in order to enter with the general Master of Architecture students in the spring and get an abroad semester. So my first semester at Clemson was actually in Italy, which was cool. And that was paid for by the college as well. So that was great. I ended up going 2.5 years, but it was worth it for the extra time abroad.
I want to go back to, before we start discussing Clemson a little deeper, I want to go back to the application. I was wondering, what was the part of the process that we used that you found most useful?
Oh, let's see. There were several, I think. I think, it was my first time utilizing any kind of outside service like this, in undergrad. And of course, you go through portfolio development classes and you can find blogs online, but really just having someone look comprehensively at you and having that outside perspective, and seeing you were able to connect dots about me that I wasn't maybe able to see myself, or formulate a narrative that was strong and obviously, not convincing in crafting it in an inauthentic way. It was still very, very authentic, but it took someone on the outside to help formulate that or help me see that. So that was really helpful. And then also just the process of distilling down. I think in my particular case, I had so much difference. I had, archaeology work, I had architecture work, I had a whole graphic design and fine arts portfolio and theater, and I feel like I had all of these pieces. And so I think the process of kind of narrowing it down to 3 or 4 projects to tell an overall story about myself and synthesizing that with my narratives, and made sure my whole package was cohesive. Everything from the cover letters that I wrote, to the essays, to how the portfolio read, to like what the key points were that I needed recommenders to say and to validate or to speak to. Yeah, it was, I mean, you're branding yourself, right? It's like a whole process, and I've never done that before. And I think that was, I know that's probably a very generic, large answer, but I think that you need that in order to apply to architecture school successfully. And I think that having that clear sense of yourself and formulating and really, really being, yeah, I guess, yeah, clear about that's really important. And I think that makes all the difference in a successful application versus one that's just mediocre.
You feel that some of the skills, I don't know if you brought anything from the things that we worked on or learned during that process into your studies at Clemson. Did it benefit you at all as a student at Clemson later on? Or did you discover something new about yourself or not?
Yeah, I think like from just the hard skills perspective on, the composition of a portfolio and what all needs to go in there and how you were very process driven. It was never about the product in my portfolio. I don't know about other portfolios that you've coached or worked on, but mine was always a process. And I think I took that narrative through a lot of my subsequent portfolios and applications for fellowships, applications elsewhere. And it just sort of evolved, and it was really interesting. I've been going through this process now, applying to different awards, or being nominated for different awards and having to provide all these materials for. And looking back, I still reference that portfolio, and I still kind of see how, again, that process of branding yourself and being really like kind of boil down and synthesize what you're about and what are your values. And that was the backbone decision for why I chose my school. That was, of course, the narrative I displayed throughout the portfolio, but then that becomes still that same background. It's different work, different contexts, different scenarios that you're still going through in life, right? But it's still the very core things that you fall back on. So I think, those I still definitely used throughout and still do, which is great.
Terrific. I want to talk a little bit about your awards now. Let's talk about where you are now, and then maybe talk about Clemson, because I want to discuss Clemson compared to where you are now and how it helped you get to where you are. Because you're already very successful, on track to greatness. So I'm just curious. Let's start from that. I know that you received some awards. Let's just mention them. Let's just list them. And what is that you do specifically, and where do you work?
All right, so this is a whole story, Ela. My whole path after Clemson is quite a story. But yes, right now I am in Washington, D.C. again. I work at HOK in their healthcare studio here. I'm a medical planner and a healthcare designer. And I've been here now since 2017. So a couple years, and love it. Absolutely love it. Let's see. So yeah, this past fall, I recently won a.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. I know that you also worked for a very good firm before HOK, which was
I did.
Design, right?
Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I worked for. I also worked for Mass Design Group right out of school. So that was, I was awarded a big fellowship right when leaving Clemson, called the Global Health Corps Fellowship, and that was. An honor and a big achievement to win. And I went to work for Mass Design Group. I was working on different prototype hospitals, and specifically the Narragansett District Hospital. And while I was at Mass too, it was kind of an extension of thesis work that derived from my Clemson studies in terms of prototype hospitals and, kind of the intersection of policy, global health, and architecture, which was great. Yeah. So that was my path right out of school, and then I obviously am now with a more global focused firm, HOK, which has been wonderful too.
And how have you been doing since you joined HOK?
Pretty well. Yeah, I've been doing very, very well. So since joining HOK, I've been working on really large scale healthcare work, kind of all over the US. And I've been working on very large scale projects with international teams too. That has been really rewarding. Specialty hospitals that, it's a scale, like I liked the work that we were doing at Mass. I ended up having some kind of disappointments, I think, with the firm at large, leaving there, to be honest. But I think I was inspired by, their work and the idea behind it. But I was looking for more of a learning opportunity and a reality that was kind of more in line with where I needed to grow as a designer and a leader. And I'm finding that very well at HOK. It's been a good fit.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your aspirations as an architect. What are your goals? Let's talk about that first, and then we'll go back to Clemson because I really want to talk about Clemson. But let's talk about your goals. What are your aspirations for the future? Where do you want to be when you're 60? I think I've asked you all the time.
I don't know. It changes. I just recently won this big award called the Rising Star in Design, Healthcare Design Award by Healthcare Design Magazine, and that was a huge honor. And I feel like they ask you the same thing, and I still don't know the answer to where I want to be or what I want to do. But I think, right now, I'm in an environment that I'm learning how to take on these large scale projects. I'm learning how to manage them. I'm learning how to plan for billions of dollars of infrastructure and specialty tertiary healthcare. And I think I want to still be a leader in that. I think when I look back at Mass, that was my dream job forever. It really was. And I think that I learned some really valuable lessons about what to do and what not to do. And I really learned and also very much unlearned a lot about myself in that process. So I think, having other firms that are competitive in that nonprofit market to really validate some of those things or to bring a rigor to it that I feel is very much needed, at least in the space of healthcare, is something I would love to start. It's something I would love to do, but in order to be the leader in that space, I very much need to learn how to do that well and not just jump in and pretend like I can do it well, So that's sort of my driver and where I hope I end up. And I really want to supplement my education even after this with public health, Master of Health Administration, something that is more in the arm of healthcare and health policy and delivery. So that's another stepping stone. So that's a long-winded answer to say I don't know, but I think I'm on the path to getting there. And I guess my dream would be filling the gaps that I saw very much in working at a nonprofit and being those gaps, filling those and being you're editing this out, right? It's like
yeah.
Okay, like I guess my dream is just in order to be a leader in that space, I saw all the gaps and they're pretty gaping and I'm really dedicated to filling them. So, and that's a lot of personal growth and professional growth that has to happen in order before I make that jump into more of that sector.
Right. Do you feel that a business degree or an administrative degree in maybe public policy or something like that is necessary, or is just something that would be just a nice feather in your cap?
No, I think it's necessary. And I also think that, or finding, a partner or someone with that we would complement each other, but I do think just from a personal, I'm always a learner. I obviously love learning. So I think for me personally, to understand a whole different business side of it would be critical. And I also think that bringing design thinking and leveraging that into alternate careers is also valuable. So I think my peers would also have a lot to learn from me in a program like that. Or I would have a lot to offer the program.
Yeah, is the nonprofit model of IDO perhaps something that you're interested
I love IDO.
Yeah, they also have IDO.org, which is their nonprofit arm. Is that fits more your?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I'm very interested in that. So we'll see. I'm still trying to figure out the right, the right fit. So at least with HOK, it's been awesome. I've been able to do a lot of pro bono work through the firm. And I've also been able to lead some of those initiatives too. So also academic and professional partnerships. I've also been able to volunteer and do some work with, which has also been very inspiring and a more sustainable model, I think, in a lot of ways, but also, shortcoming that maybe a for-profit or a non-for-profit model would also fill. So I've been learning a lot about different models of architecture and kind of the realities of operating within each one of them. So it's, that's been interesting.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about Clemson now. I think that my main interest is to find out whether schools of architecture, in your case, Clemson, actually managed to prepare you for the career that you want.
Mm.
Schools of architecture tend to be very expensive, and they're essential. They have to be an investment, and you have to get a return on that. Do you feel that you're getting that return, and do you feel that you have been prepared for what you expect to achieve in your life?
Yes, 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 yes. Again, I think that's one of the best decisions I made was going to Clemson, and especially that program because like my goal was pretty narrow in terms of I really wanted to do something with healthcare, and I knew that pretty much. I mean, if you look at the Clemson alumni network from healthcare architecture, I mean, they're the heads of every single big major firm, and they're doing really, really amazing things. And that network is so tight knit. So I knew that having that and learning from those people are like I couldn't get a better education and experience and leverage that. So that has been really, really valuable. Versus if I still had that interest in healthcare and say I went to a Berkeley, for example, and not to say I couldn't absolutely still do great in healthcare architecture, but I think I would have had a disadvantage versus coming from a program like Clemson. So
That you will not be as well positioned in the field of
yes, yes,
architecture.
and not. I mean, you can still. I mean, Berkeley's an excellent school, right?
Right.
But I just mean that from the field of healthcare architecture, I
Right.
think that was positioning me much better to go to Clemson in order to have a career in that way. And also, I mean, just the rigor of the academics, they do train you to be a generalist specialist degree. So on top of the healthcare classes, I also had to take all the regular Master of Architecture requirements and classes, right? So it really is a rigorous program to train you in both modes. But all of my projects were very focused on health and wellness in the built environment, but not just I'm going to design a hospital or I'm going to do this clinic. It was very much more about One Health and the environmental health and sustainable impacts on building structures, and kind of seeing it as a more holistic view of health in the environment, and not just punctuated by hospital here, clinic here, like something really prescriptive, I should say. Yeah, so that was really helpful. And I think also Clemson allowed me to, and especially my relationship with David Allison, who's the head of the healthcare program, he was the biggest influence and mentor to me in that program. I can't say enough good things about Dave, although he's tough. He's really tough, and that program was very tough. It was,
With
he
David
was,
is the head of the program.
yeah, David's the head of the program, but he really also allowed me a lot of opportunities to do. I mean, I think I was the atypical Clemson student in that I just kind of crafted my own like itinerary, even from the beginning, right, of wanting to go and study abroad in Genoa. But I also did a thesis or graduate student thesis where I was looking at, actually, you know what, I'm going to step back a minute. Before then, when I was a student, a friend of mine and classmate of mine and now colleague, she and I were, it was back in 2015 during the Ebola epidemic, which is kind of of the times now. It's still very relevant, but we entered into a competition for a mobile isolation unit to curb communicable disease outbreaks for specifically in East Africa, and we won the competition. It was an international competition from the Union of International Architects Public Health Group, and that kind of jump started my interest in kind of doing these more developmental projects and also prototypes, and kind of what happens to those models afterwards, and how can you have a little bit more of a sustainable implementation of those. So that kind of led to my thesis work, which the following year I won a big fellowship to look at storefront primary care delivery and prototype healthcare facilities that would be integrated into developing context. And I got to go to Ethiopia and in Addis Ababa and help implement them. So, and then from there, I won the Global Health Corps Fellowship, which took some of that work further into the stuff that I was working on at Mass. So it was kind of this big snowball of of things. But again, I would never have been able to do that without going to a program like Clemson and having those opportunities and winning those competitions and having those fellowship and awards that were able to support me.
So can we deconstruct the program a little bit more? Can we talk about the people involved in the program? You mentioned David before, but can you talk about the faculty as well as the students, as well as in general the life of a Clemson student? What was your experience like, not just academically, but also personally?
Okay. So again, I think Clemson, it has the General Master of Architecture program, and it also has the like the healthcare studio, right? And those two studios sit separately within the building. The building was designed by Thomas Pfeiffer, so it's a really beautiful modern addition to kind of their older architecture building on campus, and really collaborative space in that building. I know, again, we sat in a different section, so we kind of have our own. It operated more like a firm. Everyone had their own kind of desk and computer, and it was a very kind of different experience than maybe what people would have experienced in Lee Hall, although still in the very much the spirit of the collaboration and kind of open floor plate, and everyone knows what everyone's doing, and it's very, very fluid. I would say that one of the things I wish that happened more and during my time at Clemson was more of an integration between the general program and the healthcare program. I mean, it happened, of course, in like the overlapping coursework and classes that we had to prepare, but I think there was a divide, and naturally, because we would be working on specific projects for our program and they would be working on specific projects for theirs, but just more of that cross collaboration, you know. And when it did happen, it was wonderful, right? Like different design build opportunities in their the General Master of Architectures, like they have a concentration in community build. You know, like integrating some of those with health and healthcare would have been cool, and I think that's something that would be neat to see in the future. In terms of,
I'd like to interrupt you there. This is something that a lot of students are complaining about. The fact that there's no integration between, let's say, the building technology course that they take per semester, the studio course, maybe the history, theory, and criticism course. In your case at Clemson, you have that, you know, one more variable, which is, of course, the healthcare administration courses that you take. How would you suggest that happens? I mean, how can one integrate all these different fields together in a way that you're productive and in a measurable way you can actually say that you've achieved the separate goals for each course, at the same time integrate them in one thing?
I think that's a really good question. I think, you know, in terms of Clemson's case, I would have loved to have been able to take more electives. Like our program was so rigorous. We had, you know, very set classes each time. I think we had room for 2 electives throughout my 2 years there, to be able to branch out and take some of those coursework or kind of cross courses. But I do think that it's more maybe in the studio rather than in the elective courses that could happen. Excuse me, whether that's have, you know, a joint effort in terms of like having different studios come together on a joint project, or whether that's a vertical studio where you have second years working with first years on a similar project, and then you can branch out in different aspects and tailor it to the specific academic point and learning objectives that they're at right there. There needs to be more of that. I mean, the other thing that I would say that I was shocked at when I left Clemson was we worked on projects with groups and with teams pretty much my entire career at Clemson, right? I think I maybe worked on one individual project like once for a semester, like one semester. And I think that's so important because some of my colleagues that I work with today have come from other programs where all they did was individual work. And I mean, they even described studios where you put tents over your your desk so no one sees what you're doing. And that just to me is absurd because that's not architecture. It will never ever operate that way. It is never about you. It's always about a teamwork, and you know, projects don't operate in silos. And so I guess in that aspect, I was very happy I went to a program, but I know some students were very like, they wish that there was more one-on-one or like kind of solo projects so that they could distinguish themselves or so that they could try a different avenue. So I don't know what the balance of that is, but I do know that I came from a program whose pedagogy was very much all about collaboration.
Is there anything else that you feel you didn't like about Clemson?
I think, you know, I mean, Clemson, it was a blessing and a curse that it was in the middle of like nowhere in South Carolina. So I had never been to South Carolina prior to going to Clemson. I mean, I guess maybe like Myrtle Beach when I was growing up, but that doesn't really count. So on the one hand, you know, that kind of isolation from other places, you know, I mean, Greenville's a wonderful city, but an hour away. You're 2 hours from Atlanta, you're 2 hours from Charlotte. So that rural life was coming when I was moving from DC there, or I guess in this case, Italy there too. That was a shock. It was definitely a shock. Small town living was a shock. I think there are 6 bars at Clemson, 2 of which are like okay for graduate students to go to. Um, so I think that was good in the sense that the only thing to do was study and like be in studio. There was literally nowhere else to be. But then the bad thing was you kind of, you don't maybe get the exposure that you would going to a school in the middle of a city like New York or Boston or DC or something. So that was the struggle.
So you brought something very interesting up. You spent most of your time in studio, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Like
3
I think
hours,
I
80 hours?
slept. I mean, I also I was also like the graduate assistant to Dave. So, I mean, there was a group of us, of course, each year that were, but I think also on top of my coursework, I, was owing him work or working for the school for 20 hours of my week too, which happened in studio. So, yeah, I mean, they set you up there to work, live, and breathe in studio. And I know that that's a big point of contention right now with not just Clemson, but a lot of schools are talking about that unhealthy expectation and balance of always being there. I mean, we always worked on group projects, so that's where you meet, that's kind of what you have to do. And I guess I have a mixed feeling about that. On the one hand, that environment over time could become toxic, but it's also like, I mean, a lot of the innovation happens at 3 a.m. when you're sitting there next to somebody, sketching or like working on a project. So it was, again, a blessing and a curse, but just the nature of it. I don't know that I agree that architecture school has to be that way or should be that way, but it is that way, I think, regardless of where you go, for better, for worse.
What about socializing? Does socializing play an important role in the architect's education?
It should. I think in my case, that was something I personally struggled with a little bit. The good thing about Clemson was that in my 8-person class, half of us were from or were international students. So I did feel like I got, despite being in a small town in South Carolina, a lot of diversity within the program and diversity of thought, which was great. But I do think that in general, I think graduate students, this is horrible to say, but like they're the most miserable people, right? I mean, you're like barely getting paid, you're barely getting by. Like it's just really not a lot to be happy about, right? You're always getting criticized, always working on a project, completely like not eating well, probably not sleeping. So I don't mean to paint that a grim picture, but it is kind of that thing you have to go through. And I can't say I was happy always going through that. I think socialization is, yes, very important, but I know that is something that, I mean, I made some of my closest friends in graduate school, but that was like, because we spent all the time together regardless, it was like a family, and families are both functional and dysfunctional. You love them, but it's, there are tough times too. So I think it's a mixed bag. At least that one with me is something I personally did struggle with a little bit, is just maintaining a balanced and healthy social life. And when there are so many demands on your time and there's so much that you have to juggle with school.
Before you mentioned that you missed being probably in like a large urban center or close to a larger city or something where things were happening, only 6 bars, etc. Had you been in New York, let's say that you had the opportunity to go around and experience the city, or Boston, or like another place, do you feel that it would have made a difference in your education if you had the opportunity to experience the life of the city, etc.? In what way?
I think so. I mean, I think, you're inspired by your surroundings. And I think a city like Boston and New York has so much heritage and history and museums and resources and just general avenues to explore and learn in other ways, right? So I could imagine on the one hand, and in my head, because I obviously didn't go to a city, school in a city, it would be like this mecca of learning, right? It's like you have, but then, yeah, to your point, I do you balance that with the guilt of not being in studio? Can you afford it? Like, I mean, you're a student, right? So I don't know. I guess that's like a double-edged sword, but you can still absorb. And I'm a big sketcher, as you know. Like I feel like I would have drawn a lot of inspiration from case studies or going to visit offices or firms or seeing what work was happening. I mean, that's, you don't need money or you just need time, right, to do that. So I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting to think about, but I think I would have been inspired by that surrounding, and I think students can be for sure. I think it's just the balance of doing that on top of schoolwork and being able to kind of find that balance. But I do feel like more opportunity could come to you in a bigger city in a lot of ways too. For me with Clemson, the biggest thing was like our network. You know, I mean, we have alumni all over the world, and we're very, very close. And you know, we were thankfully, as part of the healthcare studio, able to go to different conferences and events and travel a lot for projects. And so I did a lot of traveling when I was at Clemson. But I imagine in a big city, if you had a lot of those resources right there, that would have been different. So.
If you were, is there any course that you would add to the curriculum of Clemson? Anything? You could add 2 or 3 courses. What was missing from Clemson?
So again, from the healthcare studio, we were very. I feel like I got an excellent education in healthcare planning, and I feel like that I was able to push the boundaries of, you know, to have a great healthcare facility or any facility that facilitates health, so to speak. You have to marry both the planning and design, right? I mean, you can, whereas I think in other design studios, you would focus on the gem of something, right? It has to look a certain way, it has to be beautiful, but you know, that's so disconnected from the reality of needing to function. So you have to kind of find the in between. And I think we were very heavily educated on how to make something work and how to make something very effective, and then design, you know. And I think marrying those two is always a struggle, even in practice. But I do wish that maybe we had one studio that was a little bit more like focused on design only, right? Which I know a lot of other, that might go back to my point of that cross collaboration, right? Because whereas the general students, they were very focused on form and on composition and materiality and articulation and such. Not that, I mean, we definitely touched that, but it was in a very different capacity, right? So I really wish maybe we had focused on those aspects a little bit more for at least a studio or so. And then be able to kind of strengthen the design of some of our more functional like needs of the project. But again, that's very specific to healthcare. So that would just be my one wish, that we could have maybe spent a little more time in design. But you know, that being said, it's always going to be that. I mean, it's even in practice, that's the balance, right? I mean, you work with designers who have never done healthcare, but they are very, very excellent at facade articulation, and they move something, and you know, you have to work back and forth because they need to know what's informing it behind what's informing it, you know, behind the wall and in front of the wall, and why something can work and why something can't. And yes, it could be about a form, but it also has to function. So it's a constant battle. So, but I do wish we had a little more of a development in design. They operate on kind of an every other year too. So because I'm a class of 8, the class above me was 8 people or 7 people, 7 to 8. But our office or our studio operated like an office of all of us together, right? So for our first semester, in order to kind of integrate, it was all 15 or 16 of us working on a vertical studio project, which, you know, kind of looks at the more macro site aspects of health. So we did a lot of like kind of larger landscape design and building placement and understanding more of the sustainability aspects of that and narrowing it down. And then each person would take a parcel within this larger context, right? So we would do all the group work and you know, maybe you'd have the entire studio working on kind of all the site models and analysis and so forth. And then the next phase of it would be 2 or 3 of you kind of develop a specific section underneath those, and then each of you take a specific piece to develop further. And those pieces, you know, we've done doctors' housing, we've done you know, low-income housing. Yes, the housing can be part of that, but it's within a larger systemic context of like kind of a healthcare campus or a health environment. So the first semester was very general and kind of big like that, but I loved it because you worked at all different scales. And you came out with a project that was still like something that you did within it, but also something you learned from a teamwork together. And it was a great way to get to know your peers above you and kind of learn the process and so forth. And then our second semester, we split off into 2. So my class of 8 and then the class above me, they all worked on their comprehensive project or their thesis, right, in their second year. And we worked on an individual or smaller group project. And those ran, let's see, we did a small federally qualified healthcare clinic on campus. And then we also won a grant through NCARB to look at that further. And we did a whole research development with them. Some of the second year projects in that time were, you know, Anjali Joseph, she was the PhD student or PhD chair and professor. She's fabulous, and she won a big grant for the OR project. So part of them also worked on this design build of this operating room at MUSC in Charleston, which was really cool. And that was a 4-year research grant, so we did parts of that as well. And then, of course, I did the competition, so I feel like I had the time with a colleague of mine to do a rapid response, a vehicle for curbing communicable disease outbreaks. I'm trying to think of some of the other project types we did. I mean, we've done the whole hospital. One of our semesters is very dedicated to a hospital, a tertiary hospital facility, which is important. And then the other one can be kind of like, I elected to do a thesis, so a personal project that I wanted to work on. And so, I mean, in our other classes, we were able to be more exposed to a residential project, like, for example, our professional practice class, or some of our professional documentation classes of like learning, CDs and how the progression of that goes. We would do smaller projects like that. But yeah, I guess to say this is, sorry, a long-winded answer, but there were aspects about those things integrated within parts of our projects, but like I didn't have to necessarily design a residential facility as part of a project. Like only, right? It would be that within a bigger build. So, I mean, I guess you could say that would have been nice too, maybe to do a different typology of project. But I figure too, if you're going to that specific program for healthcare, like, that's what you want to do. That's, you get a lot of different angles to that. That was really helpful.
What was your thesis about?
So, as I mentioned before, it kind of started back in 2015 after winning that the competition with my classmate, and so we kind of looked at those structures, and it was a rapid deployable model, using shipping containers and converting those into kind of these villages that were around Sierra Leone that could kind of prototype and rapidly assess different specific needs for Ebola camps. But then, like, what happens to that after, because so many of these, as we're seeing even right now, so many of these facilities that we're converting or that we're kind of building in these cases, like, they have a life after. And I guess I wanted to marry that with some of the other work that I was kind of looking at in terms of prototyping and the concept of more of a sustainable approach, looking at policy more in terms of how healthcare infrastructure and healthcare infrastructure policy can inform standards or inform and elevate health in general. So I kind of took those two ideas and again was looking at more storefront. I think it's like storefront primary care facilities that then turned into more storefront settings within developing context. And like I said, I looked at doing kind of a health and healing village in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. It was a primary care facility at first that kind of evolved into more of a district health center. But yeah, it was kind of using also the more informal aspects of your life and how health can integrate into that, right? Into more accessible settings for people rather than tertiary facilities, which is a trend we're seeing even here in the US, right? We're seeing a lot of those pop-up clinics and branding and kind of the whole total health and trying to be more accessible even on your phone now. So yeah, so my thesis was looking at those prototypes and template design and kind of adapting those to different conditions. And then, yeah, that was what got me into Global Health Corps. And, we took that. I mean, Mass had done a lot of work in that realm already. They worked with the Ministry of Health in Rwanda and also Liberia to develop their infrastructure standards, which were very similar prototypical examples, just at a bit of a larger scale. So is where I was looking in Ethiopia at healthcare clinics that were kind of a smaller, like community health clinic scale. They were looking more at a district hospital scale. But it was cool because that's still a very fluid document, and we were able to inform it through the design and kind of the realization of two of the prototype hospitals. And I worked mainly on the urban one, which is my thesis was in the urban realm, right? So that was like perfect. I mean, I really got like my dream job. Like it was really a really neat opportunity to work with them and to contribute. So yeah, and that project just got built. So I think it just opened this past month or 2 months ago, which is really exciting. We'll see. Yeah, I would love if someone did like a post-occupancy evaluation on it, just to see, if everything we designed was able to be realized, or if there were opportunities missed, or what the lessons learned could be. Yeah, that would be the next step.
What are your recommendations for people applying to architecture school as far as their studies at architecture school? What should they look out for? What should they do? What should they not do? Um,
Well, I think you told me this once actually, and it stuck with me. Like, would you rather be a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond, right? So I think it really helped me to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond, for sure. I mean, it allowed me to have a lot of opportunities and that I otherwise probably wouldn't have in a bigger in a bigger pond. So I definitely think people should look at more than just the name brand of the school. I mean, I know I struggled with that. And I know that you know that because we went through this whole thing together. But again, I graduated at a time when I think the value of the brand name of architecture school was diminishing in lieu of what graduates could do after, right? I mean, we were in the middle of the recession, and the first question people would ask you is what can you do? Can you get started? Do you know these programs? Like, and that's still very real. And I think even in this recession that we're going to inevitably go through again now, it's going to be the same thing. So not that brand name doesn't carry a certain weight, and the networks that you can derive from those are very valuable, but not just to do that for name brand sake, right? I mean, the individual attention, the type of education you're going to get, and just who you're going to be connected to, because I think that has been far more valuable, and it's advanced me in my career. Is who I know, who I was able to be exposed to, and kind of that network that you're building, because that to me is critical. I mean, no one asks me anymore like, where'd you go to school? What do you do? I mean, they do, but it's not that important, right? And but what's important is kind of your application of your education rather than the brand name of it. And I don't know. I think that was a really big lesson. And I think that's hard for architects to understand too, or to let go of. So I don't know.
What about once planning one's career? What should they? I guess it's never too early to begin planning your career even before you've attended architecture school. So,
Right.
what's your advice for young architects for applying to architecture school now, as far as planning their career? Aside from
I mean, I think it's important. I would tell anybody before they apply to their master's program, if they have a background in architecture, to try to work in architecture, at least shadow an office and a reality before you decide to sign up for it, because even the experience in school is going to be far different than what practice is, right? So I know a lot of my colleagues have had shock coming out of school, having never practiced. Maybe they went straight from undergrad to graduate school, and then they get out and they're like, oh my gosh, this is so different than what I thought this would be. And either that's a good thing or sometimes that's a bad thing, and then they're like, well, what did I do? This isn't what I want to do. So I think just being really real about practice, and, we spend so much time learning to be designers, but, the reality is design is only a fractional part of the entire building process, right? And again, it's not individual, it's group work. And there's so much more to it than what you're going to learn necessarily in school. So just knowing that, and I think, but the translation of design thinking can happen even in an industry or a career beyond architecture, right? So I think that's been one of the biggest things that I've learned is that you have skills that translate across multiple are valuable skills of problem solving and critical thinking, and being able to see the possibility of something, or to spin a situation or a project into creating something much larger than the built product itself, right? I mean, architecture does go beyond just that building and just that object. So I think keeping that in context too, for young designers to realize that there are many other avenues, that architecture isn't just going to be like you're going to sit in an office all day designing a building. There are many, many other opportunities, and it really is a good springboard and platform for that type of thinking, right? And that it can prepare you for a multitude of careers as well, but also to just, I don't know, have more exposure, the better. I don't know if these are all too lofty and too general.